The P-51 Mustang versus Messerschmitt Bf 109 is World War II's most famous American and German fighter rivalry. But what happened when the Mustang met the Luftwaffe's other elite fighter, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190? Which aircraft really had the edge? From late 1943 onward, when P-51B Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into Germany, they encountered Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighters defending the Reich. These were not the early A-model Focke-Wulf Fw-190 aircraft that dominated in 1941 and 1942. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was flying Focke-Wulf Fw-190 A8 series aircraft and the high-altitude D-9 Dora variant, both formidable opponents for any Allied fighter. The matchup came down to altitude and tactics. Below 15,000 feet, the Fw-190 was a monster. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced massive power at low altitude. The wide track landing gear and excellent visibility gave German pilots confidence. The armament was devastating. 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns on the A8. One solid burst could shred a Mustang. But the P-51 had advantages the Fw-190 could not match. Above 20,000 feet, the Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger gave the Mustang superior performance. It climbed faster at altitude. It turned tighter in the thin air. And it had range, over 1,600 miles with drop tanks, which meant P-51 pilots could choose when to fight and when to disengage. The Fw-190 had perhaps 500 miles of range. German pilots had to fight over their own territory or run out of fuel. When these two fighters clashed at high altitude, Mustang pilots used energy tactics. They avoided turning fights where the Fw-190's roll rate gave it an edge. Instead, they used speed and climb performance. Dive on the 190, fire a burst, then climb away before the German could react. The Fw-190 could not follow a Mustang in a sustained climb above 25,000 feet. The BMW engine simply did not have the power at that altitude. The Fw-190 D-9 Dora changed the equation slightly. Introduced in late 1944, the Dora used a Junkers Jumo 213 inline engine with improved high-altitude performance. It was faster than the earlier A models at altitude and could climb with the Mustang. But by then, Germany was running out of experienced pilots and fuel. The Dora was a deadly opponent in the hands of an ace. But most Luftwaffe pilots in 1945 were poorly trained and flew predictable defensive patterns that American pilots exploited ruthlessly. The numbers tell the story. American claims versus actual German losses are always disputed, but the trend is clear. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force P-51 groups were achieving kill ratios of 4-to-1 or better against all German fighters, including the Fw-190. The Mustang's range allowed it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Fw-190 had to operate close to its bases. When fuel ran low, German pilots had to disengage, giving the Mustangs free rein over the bomber streams. But the Fw-190 was no slouch. In the hands of skilled pilots, it remained dangerous throughout the war. Kurt Buligan scored 112 victories, many against American heavies and their escorts. Gerhard Barkhorn flew Fw-190s and scored over 300 kills, though most were on the Eastern Front. When a veteran Fw-190 pilot caught a Mustang below 15,000 feet, the outcome often favored the German. The Fw-190's firepower meant one good burst was usually fatal. The Mustang's liquid-cooled engine was vulnerable. A single 20mm shell through the radiator, and the Merlin would seize within minutes. There were also weaknesses on both sides that pilots learned to exploit. The early P-51Bs had gun jamming problems that left pilots defenseless in combat. The Fw-190's radial engine was tough, but produced a lot of drag. limiting top speed. The Mustang had better dive performance, but the Fw-190 could outroll it at high speed. A smart German pilot would roll hard, change direction, and force the Mustang to overshoot. A smart American pilot would refuse the turning fight and use vertical maneuvers. The Fw-190's biggest problem was not the aircraft. It was fuel, training, and numbers. By 1944, Germany could not produce enough fuel to keep all its fighters flying. Pilot training was shortened from months to weeks. New Fw-190 pilots were sent into combat with 50 flight hours and no gunnery training. They died quickly. The experienced pilots who survived carried the burden, but there were too few of them. Meanwhile, American pilot training was comprehensive. P-51 pilots arrived in Europe with hundreds of flight hours and extensive gunnery practice. The quality gap decided more fights than aircraft performance. The final verdict depends on the scenario. If both pilots are equally skilled and the fight occurs above 20,000 feet, the P-51 wins. Superior climb, superior sustained turn, superior range. If the fight happens below 10,000 feet and the Fw-190 pilot is experienced, the Fw-190 wins. Better roll rate, better firepower, better low-altitude performance. But in the real war, most fights happened at high altitude where bombers flew, and the P-51 owned the high-altitude fight. One often overlooked factor is pilot workload. The P-51 was easier to fly. The engine management was simpler. The controls were lighter. A tired pilot could still fight effectively in a Mustang. The Fw-190 required constant attention. The BMW engine overheated if mishandled. The controls were heavy at high speed. A fatigued pilot made mistakes, and mistakes were fatal. After a 6-hour mission escorting bombers, American pilots were exhausted, but still effective. German pilots flying multiple sorties per day were often too tired to fight well. The strategic impact was decisive. The P-51 Mustang's ability to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany destroyed the Luftwaffe through attrition. Fw-190s and Bf-109s had to defend against overwhelming numbers. Even when German fighters won individual battles, they lost the war of attrition. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively destroyed. Experienced pilots were dead. Fuel was gone. New aircraft sat on the ground because there was no one to fly them and nothing to fuel them with. The Fw-190 was an excellent fighter, especially at low and medium altitudes. It was rugged, heavily armed, and well-liked by pilots, but it could not match the P-51's range, high-altitude performance, or the industrial capacity behind American production. Germany built approximately 20,000 Fw-190s during the war. America built over 15,000 P-51s and had the fuel, pilots, and logistics to keep them flying. That is the difference between a good fighter and a war-winning fighter. So who won the P-51 versus Fw-190 rivalry? On paper, it depends on altitude and pilot skill. In reality, the P-51 won because it had the range to take the fight to Germany, the performance to dominate at bomber altitudes, and the industrial backing to replace losses. The Fw-190 was tactically superior in some scenarios, but strategically outmatched. That is the dogfight nobody talks about, not because it was unimportant, but because the outcome was inevitable once the Mustang arrived in numbers with the fuel and pilots to use it effectively. The Focke-Wulf Fw-190 remains one of World War II's best fighters, but the best fighter does not always win the war. The P-51 Mustang had the range, the numbers, and the strategic purpose. It escorted the bombers that destroyed German industry. It ground down the Luftwaffe through attrition. It controlled the skies over Europe by mid-1944. The Fw-190 fought bravely but could not overcome those strategic realities. That is the forgotten story of this rivalry. Not a question of which aircraft was better in a vacuum, but which aircraft won the war. And the answer is clear.